Dan had already met 6 months before and fell in love again, which was beautiful, to a professor at Columbia University. And they were back and forth and, phone calls, trips, whatever. And it was very, very nice because it was a new level of equilibrium.
Welcome to a special edition of Surviving the Survivor. The Dan Markell murder with Karm on crime.
So, Karm, we are close to 70 episodes in, and this is obviously a piece of art in progress. We are fine-tuning it, but the underlying theme across all our episodes is survival. No greater example of a survivor than you, surviving both the Holocaust and the loss of a son. Today, unfortunately, we have a wonderful guest, but she too is a survivor, unfortunately, of her son's murder. And we're going to get to her in just a moment. As you know, we've been following the Dan Markell case closely, and this particular interview hits home, right, Karm?
It definitely does. It's like not mano a mano, but grandmother to grandmother.
Grandmother to grandmother. So for those who have been living under a rock and don't know much about the Dan Markell murder case, I'm going to recap it for everyone. In July 2014, Dan Markell, a Harvard-educated Florida state law professor, was shot twice, murdered in the driveway of his Tallahassee home. It happened shortly after dropping off his two young boys at daycare. At the time, Dan was going through a bitter divorce. Now, the case remained a mystery until unrelenting investigators, following a tip about a Prius spotted near the scene of the crime, unmasked two hitmen, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. One of the men, it turns out, was connected to the notorious Latin Kings gang right here in Miami. Now, diligent and tireless police work linked the two hitmen to Markell's brother-in-law, Charlie Adelson, a South Florida periodontist, and his one-time girlfriend, Catherine Magbanua. Magbanua, it turned out, had two children, this gets a little confusing, with one of the hitmen, Sigfredo Garcia. She was also the ex-girlfriend of Charlie Adelson. This is classic South Florida fashion here, this kind of story. Authorities would later discover payments were made from Charlie Adelson, to Magbanua, who then in turn paid both hitmen, Garcia and Rivera. So Magbanua, in essence, was the middle woman here. Criminal trials did ensue. Garcia was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, while Luis Rivera cut a deal. Now, Katie Magbanua's first trial ended in a mistrial in 2019, but just this past May, just a couple months ago, Magbanua was found guilty of murder, expected to be sentenced to life in prison on July 29th, which ironically is when Charlie Adelson, Wendy Adelson's brother and Dan Markell's ex-brother-in-law, he was arrested in April of 2022, as I said, to have a court appearance July 29th, the same day as Magbanua's sentencing, in his role in Dan Markell's death as he sits in the Tallahassee jail awaiting trial. Both Donna, the ex-wife, Donna, the ex-mother-in-law, and Wendy, the ex-wife, have not been charged, but they have both officially been named as co-conspirators. Now, Karm, I don't need to tell you, our guest, that murder fractures a family, in this case, forever taking Dan away from his two sons, while also separating the boys from their grandparents, Ruth and Phil Markel. There are, however, some rays of light peering through the shroud of darkness. We are now privileged to be joined by Ruth Markel. She is the author of the upcoming book, The Unveiling, A Mother's Reflection on Murder, Grief, and Trial Life. And she's also joined by Karen Cyphers, a close friend of the Markell family, who helps run the advocacy group Justice for Dan. Thank you both for joining us. It was a lot to get through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Ruth,
Thank you.
Obviously your book is poised to come out, I believe, in September, if I'm correct about that. But let's start with a big topic, a big issue for you, and I think one of the reasons you wrote the book, and that is grandparent alienation. What was that experience like for you after the murder of your son?
First of all, let me thank you for having us on today. We really appreciate the opportunity. We thank you for running the story of Dan. This coming week is his eighth year of death, murder. And so we really appreciate all of the public support through the media and also just on a personal level. Thank you. So the issue of grandparent alienation actually came up 2 years after Dan was murdered. The first 2 years we were able to visit. And then after the period of arrests, there was a disruption in our ability to visit our grandchildren. And at that point, I had a lot of friends in New York and elsewhere who, after a little period of time, we tried to get to talk through our lawyers to Wendy's lawyer. We tried every other means of kind of communication. We even went on, Phil and I were on Dateline NBC. We talked about the grandparent issue. We had not been on anything before, like many, as you know, on TV, many grandparents, or many parents of children who have died, adult children, etc., talk about the murder. We didn't do any media for the first 2 years, but we did go out and start to talk about the whole disappointment that we had in being cut off from our grandchildren. And just to tell you, there's a statistic in Ontario, and I know it generalizes, that if you ask most grandparents what is the most satisfying experience they have, 70% would say is their grandchildren. And there are even chapters of alienated grandparents. So this was a very difficult, terrible time, really, and it was double because it was the second trauma, really, after Dan's murder.
And how long from the period of his murder was it till you actually saw your grandchildren for the first time? How many years passed?
No, wait a minute.
Well, there was yeah, go ahead.
You just said
there were 2 years where we saw them.
2 years we saw them.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Carmela, what would it do to you to not be able to see your grandchildren?
I would not be happy. I would truly be very sad. I would be very, very upset. And I think I would try to be proactive as Ruth was and has been, with the support of wonderful people like Karen.
And Karen is one of the people that did help. So Karen, without further ado, what was this legislation that passed? And, what, from a legal standpoint, what does it allow or not allow?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me. And second, Ruth just mentioned, and in Karm too, how big of a part it is of their lives as a grandparent to have the relationship with grandchildren. I just want to throw out there, from the perspective of a grandchild, especially a grandchild who's going through the trauma of losing a parent, how important and rewarding and special it is to have the relationship with the grandparent. And so one thing that motivated this entire process was keeping those two boys in our hearts and thinking about the almost Shakespearean tragedy going on, where they have access to one set of grandparents who have been named as co-conspirators to their father's murder, while being cut off from the grandparents who miss them dearly and could afford them some level of continuity and connection to that side of their family. When we began these efforts, when I met Ruth and she said, grandparent alienation as the thing that was driving her the most at that point, Florida law was extremely restrictive. Grandparents couldn't even go to a court and say, hey, we're having this trouble. We'd like to ask for your help. There was no standing for a grandparent to even file a petition. And so, while the many years that go on following, especially a complicated case like this, where there's murder and conspiracy, it felt like kids and grandparents were being held hostage by state law during that period of time when, cases get adjudicated. So it felt wrong, and we knew that it would be a challenge to fix it, especially considering that Florida has such a strong orientation toward parental rights. But we got a really great group of people together to tackle it. We've got notably members of both the Democratic and Republican leadership who were supportive of this effort over many years. Lobbyists Jeff Johnson and Amanda Stewart were extraordinarily helpful in navigating the process. But essentially, after many years and many iterations of bill language trying to narrow down what would work, the bill itself says that if the living parent has been found responsible for the death of the deceased parent, whether by a criminal court or a civil court, grandparents are able to petition for visitation. one thing I know that as I say that, anyone watching this case knows that Wendy has not been charged with anything, and she's not been the subject of a civil suit. But the very existence of the bill as it was written, part of the beauty of it is it creates, we hope, an incentive for parents to not cut grandparents off before it even gets to that point, and maybe even creates a disincentive for families to see murder as an option for handling custody disputes and other things like that.
And it's known as the Dan Markell Act. Is that right? Officially?
Unofficially, I think it was, House Bill 1119. Advocates started referring to it as the Markell Act. And, as Ruth will share, even though the provisions of the bill don't fully apply to her family at this point, she did receive an invitation to connect with her grandsons the very day the bill passed the Florida Senate.
Yeah, Ruth, can you tell us about that? It was very recently.
Yes, it was. So there were two things happened. First, I'll go back to the general story of where the trials were. So in February, February 2022, we were expected to have another trial for Catherine McBanawa, and that trial was delayed to May 16th, 2022, because of the opportunity that the prosecutors had to have the enhancement of the Dolce Vita video, which was a major piece of evidence that they really wanted to have it well developed. Anyway, it was in that period of time when the trials were changed, and also it was in the same period, and this is the coincidence that Karen is identifying, was when the Senate passed the bill, when the legislature, so it was starting to become a reality that the grandparent legislation was going to come into effect. And it was at that time that we got a beautiful invitation from Wendy out of the blue. We didn't expect anything. There had been no communication for several years, and inviting us to a bar mitzvah for the oldest son, Benjamin, who would now have his bar mitzvah May 14th. So that was the sort of the big breakthrough. And in that story is another sub-story, which was, well, I said, we haven't seen the children now for 6 years. Maybe we can go for ice cream for 45 minutes only on May 13th. And then Wendy said, well, okay, if you want an in-person visit, come in April. And first she suggested April 16th, then she wrote us back quickly the next morning. Sorry, it's Passover, I didn't realize it. And we worked out to go for a visit on April 20th. And that's exactly what we did. And the story was really, that was the breakthrough related to possibly two other very big events, possibly to the whole idea that Benjamin was becoming bar mitzvah. And there was another opening for us to get involved. So we just jumped on a plane on April 20th in the morning, 6:30 a.m. Phil and I left. We went to Miami. We met the children in South Beach. And we had a wonderful experience with them in the afternoon. We got back on the plane and came home. And this is the other side. Within 24 hours after this fantastic visit, I got a call on 6 a.m. on April 21st. Charlie Adelson is arrested. So this was 2022 in one period of 24 hours, two major breakthroughs in the whole Dan Markell story.
What is that like for you emotionally to go from one extreme to the other?
I think it was very hard, and you know what? It just shows you things can be done. So I'm a very positive person, and Wendy had put out some conditions, which on our meeting, and I had put out a few, and that when we went within the parameters, like we both knew this is 6 years. I was very worried. The boys hadn't seen us. They were very, very young children at the time. 8 years ago, they're just really 12. Benjamin's turning now. It's actually this next week, July 29th, it's a big day. It's actually his birthday, his 13th birthday. But the point I'm making is, and Lincoln is younger, so 6 years is a very long time in this period of time. So we were really hoping, that we would be able to manage a very comfortable first meeting, which we did. And that was really the best part of it. And I got a little coaching from my granddaughter, who's 16, my youngest one here. And before we left, and I just jokingly, I said, so can we give you a hug, And that's how we opened it up. And I did it in a cheerleader form when they were walking towards us. And I said, can we give you a hug? And they both, phenomenal. Each one hugged Phil, each one hugged me. You couldn't have asked for anything better.
Karen, so the Markell Act is Florida-based, but is there hope that the law will become more widespread to, on a possibly even a federal level or to other states?
It's definitely a state-by-state issue. One of the reasons why we had to do it in Florida is that Florida's laws were particularly difficult for this issue. So the roadblocks were much higher here. One of the steps that we took early on, this is something that I do generally when tackling a public policy problem, is to build out a 50-state chart and look at the full landscape of how other states approach it, what's going on. There's a lot of states where there would be no necessity for this because they already have a good process. There are a few that I think look a lot like Florida did. So that's certainly something that if we could do it here, I think they could surely do it there.
Got it. So, Ruth, in the prior to July 2014, let's just say June 2014, what was life like for the Markells, for you, for Dan's father, Phil, sister Shelley? What was life feeling like in the weeks leading up to his murder?
Actually, probably Dan's life too, I want to talk about in that period. That was probably one of the best periods from his the period of the divorce. Just to talk first about Dan. Dan had already met 6 months before and fell in love again, which was beautiful, to a professor at Columbia University. And they were back and forth and, phone calls, trips, whatever. And it was very, very nice because it was a new level of equilibrium. And at the same time, Dan always liked to come home to visit, and he had just been in Canada, and I use the word Canada, in April 2014 for Passover. So we were really probably in one of the most stable periods, happy periods, for a long time. And you see your adult child come out of a very difficult situation. You see that there is love again in his life. The boys were very, very gracious and loved to be with their cousins. So Shelley's kids are older than Dan's were, but they had a fantastic life. And also it was Passover and very fond memories. Dan leaned towards strong Jewish interest. And at the time, we had a great Seder with the kids putting on masks, for frogs and different things. So our period prior to the murder was excellent in the overall.
Karm, what stands out right away for me, being the incredible optimist that I am, is how positive Ruth is. I would not be that way. I would probably tend to gravitate toward the negative side of things. I would hold a lot of anger, bitterness. I do that normally. Are you
well, we were talking about the period that was the good period.
Are you inspired by Ruth's kind of what appears to be very resilient personality? Her positivity?
I am like Ruth.
Exactly. That's my point. So do you relate?
Yay!
Do you relate?
Of course I relate. Listen.
You lost a child. After you lost a child, how are you able to bounce back? That's something that I don't know that I'd be able to do.
Well, I bounced back. It's a long story. It's not about me. It's about Dan and about the situation there. And what I didn't have to deal with, and what I think is very painful to deal with, is all the memories of these 41 years. I lost a child when the child was very little. So I didn't have this whole history to remember, all the, graduations and awards and I just imagined that there was a lot, as they say, nachat, from Dan, that is even more painful to remember when it's not there.
And Ruth, speaking of that, Dan obviously was a very, very unusual mind. Tell us, how did you first learn this guy was a super bright individual? I mean, heading off one day to Harvard Law, becoming a law scholar. When did you know he was something different?
Well, I'm going to tell you a long story because, or a true story. Dan, this is a bit of a myth because Dan, yes, he was brilliant, but Dan is the menace. Dan didn't start out with his the height of his intellectual prowess. In fact, I'll tell you a baby story. When he was 18 months, we just moved to a new house, and the painter had come in and he put on wallpaper. And the next morning, all the wallpaper was peeled off the wall. And the painter said to me, he says, "Mrs. Markell, this is not a boy for wallpaper." He says, "But I'm going to tell you something." He says, "My little boy is in med school now. So I want you to know, as you're going to go through his life, always remember he's going to get somewhere special." And I tell these stories to other young mothers with wild kids, like mine was, and that my son made it to Harvard, and they kind of at that stage don't believe it. So Dan's early years, though, which were very, very interesting, active. He didn't use toys for the first 2-3 years of his life. He liked the pail, he liked the mop, and he had a stepladder. A stepladder was his favorite toy, of which he could climb up in the kitchen and so forth. So if you know anything about psychology and so forth, you know problem solving is an important skill. So the earlier years were really sort of an indication of his problem solving skills. And then he loved to read, but he read comics until he was 6 years old. He only read comics. And so Dan went to a Hebrew school. They had an aptitude test when they were 8 years old. And the school came back to me. He was getting about an AA minus. They said, why isn't Dan scoring? Dan scored the highest the school ever saw. Why isn't Dan's tests in school, his homework kind of stuff, so great? And I said, he's got to settle down. Give him one more year. And that's the story of really how he settled down, and he loved to read. He was very talented. So in the same way that he didn't have to work in school, this is really his strength. He went to, as he left to go to university, to Harvard undergrad, one day I had a long conversation with him and I said, "Dan, you have talent. A lot of people go to the Olympics, but they also go with practice." The Jewish word for tuchus is, they know how to sit
on
there.
Your tuchus.
Exactly. And he was lucky. He really started to work the first serious. I didn't say hard. The first years were law school. So Dan's brightness, his inquisitiveness, his moving around, everything was early. It was a stamp in life, but he was not studious at the beginning.
I have hope. You know why? My 2 daughters, 8 and 6, ran into my room yesterday telling me that their mother is about to get them special wallpaper. So I'll see if once that wallpaper goes up, I know which one of my daughters is going to definitely tear it down, and that would be the middle one. Karen, tell me what type of friend was Dan? How did you know Dan? How did you get to know Dan? And what was his impact like in Tallahassee?
Sure. Actually, the first time we met was about 3 hours after my husband and I found out we were pregnant with my first. And we went to dinner. Wendy was at the time pregnant. We were with a mutual friend with Dan and Wendy. She was then pregnant with Benjamin a few months ahead of us. And so I got to learn from them a few, tricks of the road for that. But then, they went on to have another baby very shortly thereafter, as did I. So we had 2 children back to back, both of us at the same time. Once they were young toddlers, Dan and I would intersect. Tallahassee's Jewish community is very small. And so we would end up at the same events with the same age children. If there was something to celebrate, he was there. And that was something that and he didn't just show up and be there passively. It was clear that he had such a spirit for all the passages of life, for the observances. He had this infectious energy for observing Jewish traditions, sharing them with his kids. And there's definitely there's a loss where that used to be, where he was. It was that was the type of friend he was too. We weren't particularly close, but I have some very close friends who were very close with him. And what they missed the most is how he would show up in the joyful moments, in the times of sorrow. He would model for his kids and everyone else really what it meant to live a life of thoughtfulness, reverence, seeking justice, and so on. So, all the while he didn't realize that members of the family he had married into were plotting with strangers how to end his life. And looking back on those times at some of those last festivals that we were at together, to realize that this plot was already underway at that moment. And there he was, very much living in the present. There's something, bittersweet and terrible about that.
That's eerie to hear that. Karen, we've had Jason Solomon on, who founded Justice for Dan, and I know
with Karen together.
Well, actually, I didn't found it. Jason did.
But you're very active, and tell us what the organization does and what do you do for it.
Sure. Well, I mean, I had been sort of a member of the Justice for Dan Facebook community for a while. And I had seen some of the things that Jason initiated, like the petition drive where he was encouraging Wendy to allow the Markells to have access to Dan's children. And so when we began the effort on the grandparent legislation front, I reached out to Jason for the first time to see if we could join forces in some way. And we've been working together ever since then. But it was definitely that, all the things I referenced before, like the motivation not only to see justice for the Markell family, but really for those boys who just, the thought of the conditions they were being raised in just hurt. And I think that's really what motivates a lot of us.
And Ruth, just to paint a picture, so many people follow what happened to Dan, but don't necessarily know him. You obviously have the most insight. So aside from tearing wallpaper down and playing with pails, when he got a little bit older, what was he like in his circle of friends? Was he outgoing? Was he into music, sports? Tell us a little more about him.
Well, the one thing I want to just talk about first, because I think I want this to be the way he should be remembered the most, is Dan was an outstanding father. And it's very seldom that you see anyone who is successful, and I'll talk about his success in a minute, in his career, or their career, women as well, that have so much interest, so much time, for their children. And he was a special father, really, to what I call Olympic standards, because for two reasons. One was when he could, and he would, when he didn't have the children in terms of his custody arrangement, he would go into their daycare and have breakfast with them. He would also go in and talk to all the other daycare children about what the Jewish holidays were coming around. He also had, his house was an interesting decor. He had put up a clothesline right across the large living room, and that was an open space, and he would hang their artwork. So one day when he asked me, he says, "So what do you think of this?" So I said, "Dan, I think you have something new here. It's called preschool decor. And maybe, you should get it with some kind of decorator." So that's the most beautiful things about Dan. His friends will also tell you that he was a real connector. He was well known. He had a lot of communities. He lived in many places. So Dan, he was born in Montreal, lived in Toronto, moved to Boston. He loved Harvard. We used to tease him that he's never going to leave. And he stayed there 8 years. And after that, he went to Israel. He lived in Israel. He had a fellowship. He went to England and got another master's degree. He clerked in Arizona, and he lived again in Washington after he graduated Harvard. But the point of our story is, in all of these cities, he developed a full community of friends, and he never forgot who they were. He kept up all these relationships. Sometimes there was a joke in the family that he had 100 best friends, but it was somewhat true. And so this was another important part. Of course, we're very proud. He had international acclaim as a legal scholar, and we all love that part of him as well. And he's very well known to a younger generation, which is he started Prof's blog. So Prof's blog was started in 2005. Technically speaking, it was started before his student told me this. You have to understand why we all respected him so much, or we knew him so well. So Facebook was at Harvard in 2004. Dan started Prof's blog, which was for the professors, a blog and the law students, in 2005. And Facebook went public in 2006. So this is really, I only learned this really after his murder, unfortunately, where there was this groundswelling, about him. And so he had a very large network. He was very well supported, and he had very, very defined opinions, legal opinions, about whatever was going on whatever his world of legal scholarship was at the time.
When he was 16, was he making legal arguments? Was he able to make his case?
No, actually, at 16, I'll tell you his younger careers. At 13, he wanted to be a rabbi, 12 to 13. And then he decided, instead of being a rabbi, he'll be a president of the shul and of the synagogue. And then after that, he became interested in the stock market. So at his bar mitzvah, his 13-year-old bar mitzvah, our friends gave him stocks. And so the legal part of it didn't come out until much later.
Karm, I hope that I'm considered an Olympian father to my kids, but maybe I'm just a JCC dad. I don't know. Lower level.
No, he's a good father.
So
I am very harsh with him. I'm not very, I am not very kind of just lovely darling. He says I should be more comforting to him. But as a father, I even cannot bitch about it because he is so perfect as a father.
Well, dads are different today. My dad, and I love him dearly, was not obligated nor felt the need to do a whole lot other than he worked all the time. That was I understand now as a father of three why man/woman created work, and that's to escape children. So my dad was always working. But
no, he's a very good father.
Ruth, you are a prolific, prior to this, you're a prolific author, which we did not know. How many books have you written? Because you have your new book out now called The Unveiling. But prior to The Unveiling, which we're going to get into right now, how many books did you author and what were they about?
So I wrote a lot of books actually, they were published in the 80s around women and talking about work. You just mentioned it in terms of men's work. But this was really the beginning of where women were taking on major responsibilities in the workplace. And I had the privilege of being a second generation woman executive, as I call it, because my mother had to go to work. She was a widow at 38 years old. But what her experience taught me, which besides resiliency and positive that you mentioned before, was that women had to learn to talk about money. Women had to learn how to negotiate. Women learned how to talk about cash flow, in a business environment. And I was very senior in my position I was head of health and social services in the province of Quebec. And I had all these very skilled managerial women working with me. But they would come to the final part there was a proposal that had to be presented, and the final part of the money conversations, they didn't want to do. Ruth, you take it over here. Like I should close the deal, let's call it. And then I realized that, there's a real role here. I also went for a 1-year full-time for an MBA in the mid-70s. So I was one of the first women in the program at University of Toronto where there was mature women. I was all of 33 years, but I was taking on a full-time load in an MBA program when I had 2 young children. The point of my story is not that. The point is that the leadership issues and the negotiating skills for women really was a problem. And I decided, and I was approached by a publisher actually first, that I should write a book on negotiating skills for women. And that's really what started the whole book writing experience. And then that experience moved on to, they wanted a book on the subway. So Penguin gave me an offer to write a book, which was called Room at the Top, How Women Can Manage the Challenge of Business. And subsequent to that, there was 4 other books that I wrote, all related to women, the career game, how should women play it, but everything around women's advancement and employment. And I had a successful management consulting firm for many, many years. So that's the background in writing, goes back to actually the mid 80s. And it was all related to leadership and business and women's advancement.
And this book is called The Unveiling, A Mother's Reflection on Murder, Grief, and Trial Life, which is sort of self-explanatory. What isn't is the title, the actual title, The Unveiling, which has Jewish significance. How did you come up with the title, and what is the significance?
Okay, so the title has 2 meanings. The first, I'll deal with what we would call the ritual, the Jewish meaning, which is as any person is buried, there's first a funeral. And in Jewish practice and ceremony and ritual, there's something called an unveiling, which means the monument is placed on the funeral site, the grave site. And there's also a piece of fabric which covers the monument till the day of the ceremony of the unveiling. But the significance for me is not so much just the Jewish experience. So I think your mother would understand this. So I was obviously in a grief journey. After Danny was murdered, I was very, very sad. I was in a daze. I had all those, shock effect physical symptoms. But I really didn't start the grief until, the real grief, let's call it, when the monument was placed on the site was when I really started my grief journey. And that's the significance of why I chose the unveiling, because it's not the inscription only, but it was the experience of the finality of Dan's death. The second reason, which is more important in today's, where I'm trying to go with the book, is the whole experience of lifting the curtain. So if you look at the fabric that covers a monument, I want to talk about the homicide victim. I want to talk about people who are suffering. There is so much suffering right now. Even, 1 million people are suffering, as you know, loss of people in the States to COVID. All the school shootings, this is where I really, tune in, so to speak, is all these families are destroyed. And the whole experience of what does it feel like to be a homicide victim and show what the trial life is like. So once you get this experience of violence and your death and the situation of the death of the person, you're going to start investigations, you're going to start hearings, you're going to start trials. So the purpose of the book is really to lift the veil, lift the curtain, and to give voice to the homicide victims and others.
And I think because of the fact that this is going on, and people, the cliche word which holds a lot of truth is to have closure, but we cannot have closure here because it's going on and on and on. It's almost every time the wound heals a little, something opens the wound again. And I felt in the word unveiling.
Unveiling, but unveiling is close enough.
Okay. Unveiling. I felt also that you kind of bear yourself open and show your wounds and show the pain and show the at least that's how I also understood. I know the term unveiling in Judaism, but I thought it had a more universal symbolic view also. The word
it
unveiling.
Does.
And by the way,
you're 100% right. No, because it's a part of, you're right about there's no closure. When I say closure is a word in the dictionary. And, you can call it in, psychiatric, psychological terms, complicated grief. But that's the issue really here is that you are continuously, and this is the real hard part of the experience of being in a criminal journey. You're not just dealing with normal grief. You're in an intense criminal journey. here we have, and going to be several trials and several arrests and hearings and all these sentencing now coming up. So it never stops. And that's the real problem, and the real hurt as well.
And it's going on for 8 years now. And all
Correct.
the time new Katie McBanua was just, the trial just finished. Dr. Edelson was just arrested. I mean, it's like it's still going on full throttle in 2022, like it just started.
And the book, I think, is very timely and very interesting. What you two may not know is you're both social workers. I think you both have masters in social work, Carmela and Ruth. But Ruth, you mentioned kind of this senseless.
I stayed with the clinical.
You mentioned this. I'm curious, as a civilized Canadian who lives north of the border, and this is going to take us down a short, quick rabbit hole. But
that's a big trap. Yeah.
No. But when you see this crazy gun violence in America, as a social worker, what is your thought?
I don't even want to answer it as a social worker. I want to answer it, as a citizen.
Just answer it as Ruth. Answer it as Ruth.
That's right. No, because yes, you're right. Thank you. No, there is such a difference in our culture. Not to say, we are not innocent. In fact, some of our large mass shootings and murders were very, very big. There was one many, many years ago, 30 years ago exactly, where one of the students at the University of Montreal, he didn't want women in engineering, and he killed, I don't remember, it was 18, 20 women. We've also had another one, but we don't have the frequency. We don't have the same availability, right? This is the big issue of guns and so forth. So this situation, I can't comment how for the shootings, the recent school shootings are very, very hard. Like for me, because I think, oh my God, here goes another family. I personalize that situation of what this family's life is going to change to. So I'm very much not in favor of guns. It's culturally, and as a Canadian citizen, it's not our thing. My thing for sure. In fact, when my grandchildren, when I had boys here too, I would say, you can go get anything you want, but my Canadian grandson went shopping one day and he wanted a police uniform. And he says, Grandma, Bubby, he says, I'll give you the gun, because he knew I didn't want guns. And he says, but I want the outfit. So I think that tells you a lot.
Karen, I know I feel, and I talk about this with my wife and other parents, every time you drop your kids off at school, that thought runs through your head. Could something happen? Do you feel that way?
Of course. Yeah, it's terrifying.
Yeah, I think between COVID and the school shootings and we're getting anti-Semitism, the way the country's fractured politically, there's just a lot of stress. So I think that this book is particularly poignant right now with all that. I tell Carmela, we used to hear the words Al-Qaeda and ISIS. There used to be an enemy, but now the enemy in America seems to be, the enemy is within.
Within.
Yeah. Karm,
no, but one important thing that we shouldn't finish
By the way, Karm, you've been excellent today at not interrupting. Go ahead.
I was excellent today.
Olympic level.
Olympic level. No, I think it's very important to mention that the book can be pre-ordered because it will be coming out in September, correct?
Yes, good for you. I need you on my marketing team.
Yeah, tell Ruth. Who's publishing the book? When is it coming out? And where do people pre-order?
Okay, the book can be pre-ordered right away on Amazon. Right after this beautiful session, it's coming out and available in September 20th, and it's published by Post Hill Press, which is affiliated with Simon & Schuster. So it's already available to be pre-ordered. There'll be also later, pretty much in the same time, an audio book by Recorded Books. So Carmen, come on my marketing team.
Well, I will do it from here. I can't leave because my husband is in a wheelchair.
And Ruth, we're hoping to.
Otherwise, I would go.
And we are hoping.
I will do it via other venues, you know. So
thank you.
Imitable Steve Cohen, who helps us out. His hope is that we can help facilitate a book signing down here, and we'll look forward to trying to do that sometime in the fall. Couple quick closing questions here. How do you want Dan's children to remember him?
I would like them to have as many memories as they can have, that he was a great father. And actually, Phil started this collection of some of the pictures, even starting from when the young boys had their bris, really literally. And that was one of the things that we showed on our visit. So we really have created this album. We have the first thing we did when we went to Dan's home, which is the worst thing in the world, to clean out your adult son's home who has been deceased. And but we took, at the time, all of his, I would say, Jewish symbolic personal items, like his tallis and all his prayer books and different things. So we have all of those to really create the experience and the memory for his children.
And his legacy, when people look back on Dan Markell 10, 20, 30 years from now, what do you hope they remember?
Well, similar to what kind of a great, friend he was. To us, of course, he was a great father as well, and certainly a family member. But I think that people in his group, like Karen mentioned, they'll always remember his friendship, his sense of, connectedness to all his community. And of course, he was really acclaimed as a legal scholar. He wrote many, many papers, but he actually died at 41 years old. And you would see how many professional papers that he wrote. So I think his academic contribution will hold. And I think there'll be a whole community who are still studying some of his work as well.
Karen, any final thoughts on your end? The way you'd like Dan to be remembered, how you remember him?
One thing that came to mind when you were speaking is he did leave a pretty beautiful gift behind, in that he was a great writer. And on his blog, he published, when both boys were born, he published to his friends and sent out via email these essays about the names he had given the children and the connections to the sides of the family and the meaning of that. And I hope the boys have a chance to read those someday and hear, just the amount of heart and intentional thought that was put in by their dad. So I think that's a beautiful gift that he left behind, which was that he wrote prolifically, kind of like his mom, it turns out. And some of it academic and some of it very personal. And so I think that's good. And I hope that's even his book, even the theme of one of his books on the criminal justice system and the role of family privilege. I would look forward to any legal scholar tackling that particular work and looking at sort of the terrible irony of how it might apply to the family who is behind his murder. But I think there are many legacies that he's left.
And there are many, many friends who speak up about him, for sure. And when Ruth, I have to tell you something that's funny but not funny. When Joel first heard you speak and heard that you wrote all these books and all this, he says, "Now I know where Dan got his brain."
Thank you. But Dan actually has, I have to tell you, Dan had a great writing talent. I wish I could write. He, from the day he was 16, he could bang out a paper 50 pages because the next day he had to submit it. But then he had a phenomenal range in academic, and he could write, for any popular thing, USA Today and so forth. So I would say I would still give him more talent grades, but thank you anyway.
I think I come from a small. We grew up right next to Rutgers University, and I grew up amongst geniuses, a lot of very, very bright guys. And the 5 smartest guys I know all read comic books. That's the key. You read comic books, you go to Harvard. That's the lesson.
They end up in
my
Harvard.
kids have no comic books. Ruth, any final?
Well, go get them some.
I will. I will. Any final thought you'd like to share?
I just want to say, really, again, I think that it's very important the work you do, and particularly for our family, it's a blessing. And really just keep telling stories, because the stories are important in what lessons we can talk to the public about, versus kind of keep our, in a way, it's our grief, our sorrow hidden. But I think there's something to go. And I have to thank Karen, because I really say I went from grief to advocacy, from grief to promise. And it's really Karen's initiative. I sat on this for 3 years, I have to tell you. So Karen really moved that ball forward, and she did all the heavy lifting, as they say, and created a whole community to pass a bill. And I'm sitting in Canada to pass a bill in Florida. This is a great, I will even call it a venture and adventure. So thank you all.
And at least you could do something for Dan. You could do something indirectly, and I think that anyway. I really appreciate that you came on, Karen, and that you came on, Ruth. And I hope this is just the beginning of our contacts. And I will promote the book.
Thank you so much. Carmela is now 67 for 67 and extending a goodbye. Every time I try to wrap it up, she interjects, but it was very well worth it. The name of the book, once again, is The Unveiling, A Mother's Reflection on Murder, Grief, and Trial Life. Hopefully the next book will be a happier subject, but this is an important book. Karen Cyphers, thank you so much. Ruth Markell, thank you so much. We will be in close touch, and once the book comes out, we'll have you back on.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. Love you, Markell.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.